There is a photograph that almost no one has seen. It was taken on a Tuesday afternoon in November of 1971, outside a small white-painted funeral home on the edge of Tucson, Arizona. A building that seated no more than 40 people, with a hand-lettered sign above the door and a gravel parking lot that hadn't been repaved since 1963. The photograph shows the back of a man. A very large man. 6 feet 4 inches tall, 220 pounds, wearing a plain gray wool jacket and a dark hat with the brim turned low against the desert light. He is standing at the entrance of that funeral home, one hand on the door frame, and he is completely still. The family inside did not know him. The minister inside did not know him. The 14 people gathered in those folding chairs to mourn a cattle rancher named Harold Eugene Dobbins, a man who had never made a film, never shaken a producer's hand, never done a single thing that might have brought the most famous face in American cinema to the doorway of his funeral. They did not know him either. But here's where it changes. He walked in anyway. He sat in the back row. He stayed for the entire service. And when it was over, he said 4 sentences to a widow named Clara Dobbins that she would repeat, word for word, to her children and her grandchildren, and every person who ever asked her what it felt like to lose the man she had been married to for 31 years. Those 4 sentences did not make the papers. They did not appear in any interview Wayne gave in the remaining 8 years of his life. No publicist arranged it. No camera crew followed him through that door. One man, one widow, one moment that history almost forgot entirely. This is that story. To understand what John Wayne was doing outside a stranger's funeral home in Tucson on a Tuesday in November, you have to understand the week that came before it, and the man whose death had filled those 40 seats. Harold Eugene Dobbins was born in 1919 in Cochise County, Arizona, the second son of a dryland wheat farmer who worked 340 acres of hardpan that fought back every season. Harold never left. He married Clara Reyes in 1940, raised 4 children on a cattle operation outside the town of Sonoyta, roughly 60 miles southeast of Tucson, at an elevation of just under 5,000 feet, where the grassland runs wide and flat, and the sky in summer is the color of a new bruise. He ran between 200 and 240 head of Hereford cattle depending on the year, bought his first tractor in 1957, lost a barn to fire in 1964, rebuilt it in 6 weeks with the help of 11 neighbors, and was known across 3 counties as the kind of man who showed up with a truck and a chainsaw when someone else had a problem. He did not own a television until 1968. He had seen exactly 4 movies in his adult life, and he could name only 2 of them. Harold Dobbins died on November 3, 1971, of a cardiac event. He was 52 years old. He had been mending a section of fence on the east pasture at approximately 6:15 in the morning when his heart simply stopped. His youngest son, Thomas, 17 years old, found him at 7:45. The ambulance from the Sonoyta Volunteer Station arrived at 8:20. There was nothing to be done. Clara Dobbins was 50 years old when she became a widow. She had 4 children between the ages of 17 and 28. The ranch carried a mortgage. The cattle operation needed a working hand who knew what he was doing, and she had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours since Thomas had come running back to the house. The funeral was scheduled for Tuesday, November 9th, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, at the Reyes family funeral home on South 6th Avenue in Tucson, a business run by Clara's second cousin, who had driven up from Nogales to handle the arrangements himself, at no charge, because that is what families do in southern Arizona when one of their own goes down. 14 people attended, not because Harold Dobbins was unloved, but because the ranching community in that part of Arizona in 1971 was spread across distances that made a Tuesday afternoon in the city genuinely difficult for men who had livestock to feed. 6 of those 14 had driven more than an hour. 2 had driven closer to 3. The flowers on the casket were white carnations and a single arrangement of desert marigold, and the air inside the funeral home carried the particular mixture of cut flowers, air conditioning, and something older and quieter beneath it that every person who has ever sat in a room with a casket knows without being able to name. The minister, a Methodist pastor named Reverend Carl Egan, had known Harold Dobbins for 9 years. He had prepared remarks. He had a Bible passage. He had a story about the fence and the barn fire and the 11 neighbors, because that story told you everything you needed to know about the kind of man who had died. None of the 14 people in those chairs had any reason to expect a 15th. But here's what was happening 60 miles to the northwest, at almost the exact same hour on the morning of November 9th. John Wayne was at the Rancho de la Osa, a working guest ranch in Sasabay, Arizona, that he had been using as a base of operations during a scouting trip for location work on a prospective project that never ultimately materialized. He was 54 years old, for years removed from his Academy Award for True Grit, and at a point in his career where he had made more than 150 films. 153 to be precise, if you count the serial work from the early Republic years, and had spent the better part of 3 decades doing his own writing, his own walking, his own standing in desert heat and mountain cold, on locations across the American Southwest. He knew that country the way a man knows a house he has lived in for 30 years. He knew the grade of the light in November. He knew the smell of the grass in Sonoyta. He knew the names of ranching families whose land he had ridden across during location shoots going back to the 1940s. He had heard about Harold Dobbins that morning from a hand at the Rancho de la Osa named Felix Morales, who was Clara Dobbins's nephew by marriage. Felix had asked for the afternoon off to drive to Tucson for the service. He explained why. He explained who Harold was. He explained about the fence and the heart attack and Thomas finding him at 7:45 in the morning and Clara not sleeping. John Wayne listened to all of it without speaking. Then he asked Felix what time the service started. Felix told him 2 o'clock. Wayne nodded once. He went back to what he was doing. That should have been the end of it. A man hears a sad story, nods, moves on. That is what people do. That is what almost everyone does, almost every time, because there is always a reason not to go, because you didn't know the man, because you weren't invited, because your presence would make it about you instead of him, because you are John Wayne, and walking into a room of strangers guarantees exactly the kind of attention that a family in grief does not need at their father's funeral. He knew all of that. He went anyway. Felix Morales did not notice the truck behind him for the first 20 miles. He was driving a 1968 Ford pickup, heading north on Highway 286 toward Tucson, thinking about his Aunt Clara and the sound of her voice on the telephone, when he glanced in his mirror somewhere around milepost 44 and saw a dark blue GMC crew cab holding a steady distance behind him. He didn't think anything of it. The highway was not busy. People drove north. He noticed it again at the junction with Highway 86, where a driver who wasn't following him would have had reason to go in a different direction. The GMC stayed behind him. Felix pulled into a gas station at the edge of Tucson at approximately 1:15 in the afternoon. The GMC pulled in behind him. And when Felix got out of his truck, John Wayne got out of his. He was wearing the gray wool jacket. He had a dark hat pulled low. He was carrying nothing, no flowers, no card, no envelope. Just himself, 6 feet 4 inches of him, standing in a gas station parking lot in Tucson on a Tuesday afternoon in November, looking at Felix Morales with those eyes that did not move quickly and did not look away. Felix said later that he didn't know what to say. So he said nothing. Wayne said, "I'd like to come, if that's all right with you." Not a statement. A request. He had driven 60 miles alone without telling anyone, and he was asking permission from a ranch hand he had known for 4 days whether it would be acceptable for him to attend a funeral he had not been invited to. Felix said yes. Of course he said yes. But that's not the point. The point is that Wayne asked. He didn't move the way other men moved through doors like that. No announcement. No pause to let the room adjust to him. He came in behind Felix at 1:47 in the afternoon, 13 minutes before the service was scheduled to begin. And he found the back row, and he sat down at the far end, nearest the wall, in the chair that gave him the clearest sight line to the casket and put him as far as possible from the family in the front row. Reverend Egan saw him first. The Reverend was a careful man, 9 years of ministry, 62 years of age, not given to visible surprise, and he absorbed what he was seeing with the particular stillness of someone who understands that the correct response to the unexpected is to continue doing exactly what you were doing. He continued, arranging his notes. He did not say anything to anyone. Clara Dobbins did not see Wayne when she came in. She was walking with her eldest, a son named Robert, and she was looking at the casket, and there are moments in grief where the peripheral world simply stops registering. She sat in the front row. She held Robert's hand. She did not turn around. One of the 14 did recognize Wayne, a man named Gerald Pittman, a feed supplier from Sahuarita who had grown up watching westerns and who was sitting 4 chairs to Wayne's left. Gerald looked once, looked again, looked at his hands, said nothing. That's not social awkwardness. That's respect reading the room. The service lasted 41 minutes. Reverend Egan spoke for 22 of those minutes. He told the story about the barn fire. He told the story about the fence. He read from the book of John, chapter 15, verse 13, the verse about laying down one's life for one's friends. And then he expanded it, in the way that good ministers do, to include the kind of man who lays down his time and his labor and his Tuesday mornings not for his friends alone, but for whoever happened to need a truck and a chainsaw. He said Harold Dobbins was that kind of man. He said there were not enough of them. John Wayne, in the back row, sat with his hat in his hands and did not move for 41 minutes. When the service ended, the family rose. People began the quiet movement toward the door that funerals require. The shuffling, the soft voices, the hands on shoulders. Clara Dobbins stood at the end of the front row and received what people gave her, which is to say she received the inadequate words that humans offer each other when language fails, because language always fails here, because there is no sentence in any tongue that adequately addresses the fact that a man who fixed a fence at 6:15 in the morning is in a wooden box 6 feet from where you're standing. Wayne waited. He let all 13 of the other attendees speak to Clara first. He watched the room empty, chair by chair, voice by voice, hand on hand. He watched Felix Morales speak to his aunt for 3 minutes and then move toward the door with a glance back at Wayne. A glance that asked a question Wayne answered with the smallest possible motion of his head, a motion that meant, "Go ahead, I've got this, she won't be alone." When the room had thinned to Clara, to Robert and his wife, and to Reverend Egan stacking his papers at the front, Wayne stood. He crossed the room in 9 steps. He stopped 18 inches from Clara Dobbins, and he took off his hat, and he held it against his chest, and he waited for her to look up at him. She looked up at him. She didn't know who he was. Not at first. Not for the first 2 seconds, during which she was simply looking at a very large man with a plain face and a gray jacket and eyes that were aimed directly at her with a quality she could not immediately name. A quality that her daughter Margaret, to whom Clara told this story many times in the years that followed, would later describe as the look of someone who has been to enough funerals to know that this one is the only one that matters right now. Clara would say later that she thought he was a ranch neighbor she hadn't met. Someone Harold had known. Someone who had driven a long way. She said she started to say, "Thank you for coming." The automatic sentence, the one you say 30 times on the worst day of your life because it is the only sentence your body knows how to produce. But here's where it changes. He spoke first. John Wayne, who in 40 years of confrontation and challenge had operated by a code as fixed as the Wyoming horizon line. Respond, absorb, act, but never be the one who draws first. He spoke first. Because this was not a confrontation. This was not about his code. This was about a woman who had not slept in 6 days and who had no reason to expect that the universe was paying any attention to her at all. He said, "Ma'am, I didn't know your husband, but I know the kind of man he was." Clara stopped. Reverend Egan, 10 feet away, stopped stacking his papers. Robert, standing 3 feet behind his mother, put his hand on his wife's arm and did not move. Wayne continued. His voice was the same voice, that particular register, not loud, never loud, with a grain in it like weathered wood. And he said, "A man who fixes a fence at first light on a cold morning when nobody's watching, that's not just a rancher. That's a man who understood that the work is the point. Not the credit. Not the recognition. The work." He paused. 4 seconds. Your children grew up watching that. They know what it means, even if they can't say it yet. One day they will. And then the 4th sentence. He left them something better than money. Clara Dobbins put her hand over her mouth. Not from pain, from recognition. From the precision of it. From the fact that this stranger, this very large, very still stranger who had appeared in the back row of her husband's funeral and waited for everyone else to leave, had just said in 4 sentences the thing that she had been trying to say to herself for 6 days, in the dark, in the hours when she could not sleep, because someone has to handle the practical world. He had not cried yet. He cried then. Wayne shook Clara's hand. A firm handshake, not gentle, not tentative. The handshake of a man who respects the person he is shaking hands with. He nodded once to Reverend Egan. He put his hat back on his head. He walked to the door of the Reyes family funeral home at the corner of South 6th Avenue in Tucson, Arizona, at 3:31 in the afternoon on Tuesday, November 9th, 1971, and he pushed it open and he stepped out into the desert light. He did not leave a name. Clara did not ask for one. not that day. Felix told her in the parking lot who the man in the gray jacket was. Clara Dobbins said, "I thought he was one of Harold's neighbors." Felix said, "In a way, he was." There is a particular kind of courage that never makes headlines, because it does not look like courage from the outside. It looks like a truck pulling into a gas station. It looks like a man in the back row with his hat in his hands. It looks like waiting, patiently, quietly, without requiring anything, until the right moment, and then saying the one true thing. John Wayne had spent 35 years being the largest figure in every room he entered. Not by choice, but by the sheer mathematics of his physical presence, his screen presence, the accumulated weight of 153 films in which he had stood in the middle distance of the American myth and held it up by simply refusing to leave. He was not blind to what that meant. He was not careless with it. He understood, with a precision that his public image never fully communicated, that the size of a man's presence creates an obligation proportional to that size. Not a right, not a privilege, an obligation, to use that presence in service of something larger than himself. That is not a philosophy he articulated at press junkets. It is a philosophy he demonstrated, one specific action at a time, across 54 years of living. The barnfire neighbors who gave Harold Dobbins 6 weeks of free labor understood it. The ranching families who left cattle operations on a Tuesday to drive 90 minutes to a funeral home in Tucson understood it. Harold Dobbins, fixing a fence at first light on a cold morning when nobody was watching, understood it in his bones. Wayne understood it the same way. That's not celebrity generosity. That's a man who had been watching how the world worked since he was a boy in Glendale, California, carrying ice for a living, and had come to a conclusion about what mattered and stuck to it for 50 years without requiring applause. Reverend Carl Egan finished stacking his papers 4 minutes after Wayne left. He stood at the front of the empty funeral home for a moment. The folding chairs still in their rows, the white carnations and the desert marigolds still on the casket, the afternoon light coming through the blinds in thin horizontal bars. And he thought about the 4 sentences. He had been a minister for 23 years. In those 23 years, he had spoken at more funerals than he could count, and he had heard more condolence language than most humans hear in 3 lifetimes, and he had developed, in the way that ministers do, a reasonably accurate taxonomy of the things people say at funerals. The genuine things, the performed things, the things people say because silence is unbearable, the things people say because they actually mean them. He had just heard something in the 4th category that he had not heard before. He wrote it down that night in the journal he kept. A black composition notebook, the kind used in schools, that he had been filling with sermon notes and observations for 11 years. He wrote the 4 sentences verbatim, as best he could reconstruct them. He wrote them because he knew he was going to use them, not attribute them, not turn them into an anecdote, but extract from them the principle they carried and put that principle to work. He used them in some form, in every funeral homily he gave for the next 14 years, until he retired in 1985. The work is the point, not the credit, not the recognition, the work. And then, he left them something better than money. Egan's congregants in those 14 years heard that principle more times than they could count. Some of them carried it into their own lives and their own work and their own approach to the quiet, unwitnessed labor that holds a community together. The early mornings, the fence repairs, the trucks showing up with chainsaws when nobody asked. Some of them passed it to their children. Some of those children passed it further. None of them knew where it came from. Robert Dobbins took over the Sonoyta Ranch in 1972, the year after his father died. He was 29 years old. He had a wife named Patricia and no particular plan except to do what his father had done, which is to say, fix the fence at first light, whether anyone was watching or not. He ran the ranch for 31 years. He raised 3 children on it, a son named Harold, named for his grandfather, and 2 daughters. He told them the story of the funeral more times than he could count. He told them about the man in the back row with his hat in his hands. He told them the 4 sentences. He told them what his mother had said in the parking lot. I thought he was one of Harold's neighbors, and what Felix had said in reply. His son Harold, the grandson, became a rancher too. He is, at the time of this telling, in his 40s, working land in the San Rafael Valley that his father showed him and his grandfather broke before him. He has been known, in the ranching community south of Sonoyta, for showing up with a truck and a chainsaw when someone has a problem. He has done this more times than he can count. He has never required a thank you for it. He knows where the habit comes from. He knows the name of the man in the gray jacket. Clara Dobbins lived until 1998. She was 77 years old when she died, on a morning in April, in the house she had shared with Harold for 31 years, having outlived him by 27 years and raised 4 children and watched 7 grandchildren come into the world, including a great-grandson she held once, in the spring of 1997, in the same house where the telephone call about the fence had come in November of 1971. In the last decade of her life, Clara Dobbins kept a small piece of paper tucked into the frame of the mirror above her dresser. It was not a photograph. It was not a prayer card. It was a piece of lined notebook paper on which she had written, in her own handwriting, for sentences. Her daughter Margaret found it after she died. Margaret knew what it was. She had heard it her whole life. She kept the paper. She still has it. There is a photograph that almost no one has seen. A man in a gray jacket, standing in the doorway of a small funeral home on South 6th Avenue in Tucson, Arizona, one hand on the frame, completely still. You cannot see his face. You can see the width of his shoulders and the set of them. Not tense, not braced, just present. And the particular stillness of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and is now simply doing it. He didn't know the man in the casket. He didn't know the family in the front row. He had no reason to be there that the world would have recognized as a reason. He came because a ranch hand named Felix had described a fence and a cold morning and a heart that stopped. And somewhere in that description, Wayne had heard the outline of a man he understood. A man who did the work when nobody was watching. And he had made a decision that was not, at root, complicated. Show up. Be present. Say the true thing. Leave. That's the whole philosophy. 54 years of living, 153 films, 35 years of being the largest figure in every room. And it comes down to 4 sentences in a funeral home, to a widow who thought he was one of Harold's neighbors. She was right. In the only way that matters, she was right. One man showed up. One woman heard the truth. One lesson has been carried forward by 3 generations of people who fix fences at first light on cold mornings, when nobody is watching. History almost missed this entirely. The newspapers missed it. The publicists never knew. The studios had no record of where he was on the afternoon of November 9th, 1971, because he hadn't told anyone. But Clara Dobbins knew. Robert knew. Harold the grandson knows. Margaret knows, and she has the piece of paper to prove it. One morning. One stranger. One truth that outlasted everything. But there is a question this story leaves open, and it is not a small one. John Wayne drove 60 miles to a stranger's funeral on a Tuesday afternoon in November. He waited in a gas station parking lot to ask permission. He sat in the back row for 41 minutes. He waited for every other person to leave. He said 4 sentences and walked out. He never mentioned it. Not in interviews. Not in letters. Not in any of the accounts left by the people closest to him in the years that followed. Which raises the question, was this the only time? Or was this the only time someone happened to notice? Because there is a story that the people who knew John Wayne in the last decade of his life have mentioned only in fragments, only in passing, only in the kind of offhand reference that suggests they are not sure anyone will believe them, about another act of private witness. Another room he entered when no one was looking. Another family whose life was permanently altered by something he chose to do in a moment that never made the papers. That story has never been told in full. And the reason why, that's a story for another time.